No attempt to delay, frustrate or thwart the will of the British people. No attempt to engineer a second referendum. Because some people didn't like the first answer.
G20 leaders pledged to fight protectionism as the summit wraps up in China. Also coming up, returning from the G20 to election defeat, Angela Merkel takes responsibility as her CDU party is beaten into third place in her home state. And preserving the history, frozen inside alpine glaciers, the scientists who are taking samples for the future. The desire to reduce immigration was a key driving force behind Britain voting to leave the European Union. But 2.5 months on from the vote, it's still unclear how that objective is going to be achieved. Now, we do know what the government won't be doing, however. At the G20 summit, the Prime Minister Theresa May ruled out adopting an Australian-style points-based system for immigration. She said it would be difficult to manage and wouldn't be a silver bullet. Now, that's caused some disquiet among Leave campaigners who championed this method under the slogan, "Take back control." Now, there's also been disagreement within Cabinet over the fine details of Britain's Brexit strategy. But David Davis, the minister in charge of the process, insisted in Parliament there was no attempt to slow the exit process. Here's Ben Wright.
They arrived back from their summer break by car, with bags, on foot. The recently sacked and the freshly promoted.
Are we going to get more detail today about what Brexit will really mean from David Davis?
I'm sure you'll hear a great deal of interest.
That's Liam Fox, the new Secretary of State for International Trade, heading to the Commons to hear a statement on the progress of Brexit. MPs were not expecting it to be a very long one.
Secretary of State for exiting the European Union.
Speaking to MPs for the first time, David Davis set out what would not happen.
There'll be no attempt to stay in the EU by the back door. No attempt to delay, frustrate or thwart the will of the British people. No attempt to engineer a second referendum. Because some people didn't like the first answer.
Mr Davis said the government would build a consensus around its aims.
We will decide on our borders, our laws and the taxpayers' money. It means getting the best deal for Britain, one that's unique to Britain and not an off-the-shelf solution.
But MPs on the opposite side of the Commons asked,
was that it? You've had all summer, Secretary of State. It has to be said, it is a mark of an irresponsible government, just as it was a mark of an irresponsible Leave campaign that we know nothing more about the phrase that Brexit means Brexit.
It's just been more empty platitudes from a government that just continues to make it up as it goes along.
And a leading Tory campaigner for Brexit wanted some guarantees.
This United Kingdom will take control of its borders and the laws that are relevant to that, and that is not negotiable for any other deal.
But at the moment, all the government's got is vague rhetoric. The details about exactly when divorce talks with the European Union will start and what a new relationship will look like, that could take months, even years, to become clear. As MPs argued, a demand outside Parliament for the start of formal negotiations now. For the millions who voted for Brexit, impatience with the pace of leaving might grow. Ben Wright, BBC News, Westminster.
Well, with me is Richard Cockett, who is British business editor for The Economist newspaper. Richard Cockett, I mean, on this issue of the Australian-style immigration system, I mean, isn't this what the British public voted for when it voted to leave the European Union? Isn't that what it should get?
Well, some of the politicians, the Brexiteer politicians, argued for an Australian-style point system. You could argue that, since they argued for that, the vote went their way and so we should get it. But I mean, it's plain to many people who've looked at this that this is only one option, a point system. And in fact, strangely enough, it let more people into Australia per head of population in Australia than other systems. So as a device to sort of stop immigration, as I understand the Brexiteers want, actually a points-based system doesn't serve their purpose very well at all.
Is there another system out there that you think is being seriously considered and could keep everybody happy?
Well, it's interesting you ask that, because that's what we're all asking, because the government, having rejected the points-based system today, isn't offering another option at the moment. Of course, there are other options, and one of them might be to sort of just go back to a much more visa-based system where we have categories of entrance of immigrants which you have to apply for people from the EU, and that was the sort of system we had before Romania, Bulgaria, etc. joined the EU. We might go back to that sort of system, but so far we don't know what the government alternative is.
And you don't think there's any sense that the government is softening gradually and may eventually end up trying to push forward some kind of remaining with the free movement?
Well, they might well, because, I mean, ideally, even many of the Brexiteers, they're trying to have their cake and eat it. They are saying, we want to stay in the single market, the EU single market, but we don't want to be bound by the free movement of labour. And this has been the issue all the way along. So if they can get some fudge whereby they get most of the continuing access to the single market, and also they maybe have to let in some EU citizens, a little bit more than they would ideally like, they may well take that.
But that's going to be very unpalatable for all the people
It's
who
going to be very
leave freely.
unpalatable for some of the people who voted to leave the EU. But, you know, there are, what was it, 48 million? No.
17 million
17 million
people
people voted to leave. You know, I bet not all those people wanted complete restrictions on immigration here. Some people accept that in the real world, you know, these fudges are important.
We have very little time left, but let's just try and touch on where we are 10 weeks on. I mean, are you surprised at the lack of real detail, or did you expect something like this after the frenetic June and July that we saw, a pause for thought and then hearing some detail at some point in the near future?
Well, I think everyone's quite surprised that we've had no detail at all. I mean, basically, the government still seems to have no idea about how to move forward, even in the broadest sense at all. All that's happening now is that Theresa May is gradually ruling out lots of things, but we still have very little idea about how we're moving forward. The Minister for Leaving today called for a national consensus on this, which is all very well, but of course, the implication of that is that we just want more debate, more ideas going in until they come up with some actual concrete proposals.
And I'm afraid we'll have to leave where we are economically 10 weeks on for another time. Thank you very much, Richard Cockett from The Economist.
Thank you.
You can get much more analysis on Britain's vote to leave the European Union. Just visit our website. You can find out how the vote is affecting other countries and the impact it is having on everything from jobs and the economy to fishing and the property market. Just go to bbc.com/Brexit, and there's also more on the BBC News app. Now, as we've heard, one of the main concerns of British voters which led to the Brexit vote was immigration, and many people try to reach the UK via the French port of Calais, often staying in the makeshift refugee camp known as the Jungle as they try to get across the English Channel. Today, more protests and blockades by people who live in Calais and want the French government to close the camp. Our correspondent Lucy Williamson has spent the day there.
Drive too slowly after midnight here and you're an open target. Today it was tractor pace on Calais' most notorious stretch of road. A go-slow protest by lorry drivers waging a nightly battle with migrant gangs. Joining them, several hundred residents living and working in the migrant capital of France.
This is a coalition of grievances against the migrants. There are lorry drivers here, local farmers, business owners, even some police. And despite the recent security measures and government assurances, they say the migrants are waging a guerrilla war and the solution can't wait.
They protest because it's getting worse and worse. Every night, or nearly every night, on that motorway, some trucks are attacked. There are some traffic jams, etc., because of some smugglers who have got their business in Calais and who want to make business and get migrants to get into a truck.
One attack filmed by the BBC last month shows the road blocked by logs and people smugglers threatening drivers as they direct migrants onto lorries. Local wine merchant Jerome says British customers have shrunk to a trickle because many are now too scared to stop in Calais.
We have to go step by step, and the very first step is to solve the problem in Calais, to distribute all the migrants, maybe all over France or all over Europe, maybe England take a part, and being more strict on the fact that they can't stay in Calais.
France's Interior Minister has said the jungle camp will be cleared, but Calais migrants have been dispersed before, camps raised, security tightened, and however the obstacles change, the lure of crossing the channel remains. Lucy Williamson, BBC News, Calais.
Well, staying in France, a state prosecutor is recommending that the former president Nicolas Sarkozy stand trial over allegations he illegally funded his unsuccessful campaign in 2012. An investigating magistrate will now decide whether to order a trial. The development comes just 2 weeks after Mr. Sarkozy launched a new bid for the presidency. At least 1,000 people have been evacuated from their homes as a forest fire fuelled by strong winds and high temperatures threaten popular resort areas on the Spanish coast. Firefighters, supported by water-dropping aircraft, are struggling to control the blaze near Benidorm. The authorities believe the fire was deliberately started. Remember Europe's missing robot lander that disappeared after touching down on a comet? Now the robot, called Philae, has been spotted wedged into a crack on the surface of the comet known as 67P. The photographs were taken by the Rosetta probe, which launched Philae in 2014. As we were hearing earlier, the G20 Forum of the world's major economies has agreed to fight protectionism and try to pump fresh life into the world economy. Speaking at the close of the summit in Hangzhou, its host China's President Xi Jinping said member countries had agreed to encourage global trade. The one notable success was the agreement between China and the US to curb carbon emissions, as John Sudworth reports.
Not a talking shop, but a triumph of international diplomacy. At least, that's how it's always spun. Even more so at the end of this particular G20 summit, perhaps, with the host China keen to use it to show it's both a rising and a responsible power.
Your Excellency President Xi Jinping.
In his closing press statement, President Xi Jinping spoke of the progress that's been made on financial governance and international trade.
Amid great global challenges and uncertainty, the summit attracted much international attention. With joint efforts, we have achieved fruitful outcomes.
As always, though, behind the carefully choreographed picture of cooperation, there are plenty of challenges lurking offset. President Xi met the British Prime Minister Theresa May with the deep uncertainty over the effects of the UK's decision to leave the European Union casting a shadow over proceedings. Mr. Xi also held a rare meeting with the Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, with the two men expected to touch on the thorny issue of their competing maritime claims. And the US and Russia had sideline meetings about the war in Syria without, apparently, much progress on a way forward to stem the violence.
If you want a symbol of the tension and mistrust lurking below the surface of this summit, then you need look no further than the bizarre protocol spat that's become a major talking point, at least amongst the international journalists gathered here in the G20 Press Centre.
It's not gone unnoticed that China rolled out the red carpet for leader after leader, except for one notable exception. It's being interpreted by some as a deliberate snub to the Americans, although Chinese sources are briefing, plausibly perhaps, that it was down to miscommunication, not mischief. The one notable success for which this summit will be best remembered is the announcement by the US and China that they are ratifying the Paris Climate Agreement, bringing the moment it comes into force that much closer. Proof, most would agree, that China's extravagant and tightly managed summit has been about more than just hot air. John Sudworth, BBC News, Hangzhou.
A new generation of pro-democracy activists has won seats on Hong Kong's Legislative Council in an election with a record voter turnout. The loose coalition of pro-democracy candidates have taken enough seats to block any legislation which might affect Hong Kong's autonomy from mainland China. Several of the young candidates were leaders during the 2014 umbrella protests for self-determination.
It shows how Hong Kong people want to change. And actually, we were stuck in a democratic movement, and people are voting for a new way and new future of our democratic movement. Well, I believe that every single person who voted for me made that history. I'm willing to share with them in the following 4 years and in the future.
Now, Ohio is a state that has picked the winner in every US presidential election since 1960. So it can be little surprise that both Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump are there on the Labor Day public holiday. I think we can show you the live picture from the Hillary Clinton campaign. She hasn't taken the stage yet there in Cleveland, Ohio, but this is a day regarded as crucial to picking up momentum in the home stretch of the campaigns for the election for the White House. Let's talk to Gary O'Donoghue, following it all from Washington. So Labor Day has arrived, Gary. How are things looking for each of the candidates right now?
Well, as you say, they're spending their the first blows of the autumn final push to the general election in Ohio, key state. It has the best record of predicting the presidential outcome of any state. I think something like, I can't remember reading, 93% of the time it gets it right since 1900. So it has a pretty good record. It's a swing state, one of the key states that each side will want to grasp. And I think as we go into this final push before the election, Hillary Clinton will feel that she's now the front runner. She's up in the national polls, to the extent to which they're useful. She's up in the polls in the swing states as well. She's raised a lot of money, nearly $150 million in August alone. She's even got a new plane, so she'll be feeling pretty good, I think, today. Donald Trump, however, he will feel that he's got the momentum, I think, on some of the issues. Clearly things like immigration have played well amongst significant numbers of people in this country. And he is the change candidate, after all. He is the thing that is different, and that goes a long way when it comes to elections like this. So there's still a lot to play for in this election, 64 days out from polling day.
Gary, after the conventions, when the candidates were confirmed, we were told that the Trump campaign would be changing course slightly, he'd be reining himself in, he'd be sticking to his script. I mean, has anything happened at all to the way he puts himself forward, shall we say?
Well, I think you've seen a few more sort of teleprompter speeches, if you like, scripted, policy-driven speeches, but no, not really. I mean, we've been promised a few resets, haven't we? They've happened for a few days, and then Donald Trump has gone back to the Donald Trump that he believes is the thing that's got him to where he is in this race. So there's clearly a tension there, this whole business about moving back to the centre, trying to grab hold of some of those demographics that he's struggling to get, at the same time knowing what is his appeal. So that is a tension that continues inside the Trump campaign.
Gary, thank you very much on Labor Day as things really get underway. Gary O'Donoghue there in Washington. If you want to get more background on the US presidential election, it's at bbc.com/US 2016. You can also add it as a topic on the BBC News app, which you can download from your app store now. Let's turn to German politics, because the German Chancellor Angela Merkel has accepted responsibility for her party's defeat in the regional elections in her home state. Mrs. Merkel's party finished third in the poll, with the anti-immigrant AfD party overtaking it to second place. The Social Democrats came out on top. Chancellor Merkel acknowledged that the outcome was linked to her liberal immigration policies, as Germany accepted a record number of migrants last year.
The result of the elections is connected to the refugee policy. I am the head of the party and the Chancellor. You cannot divide, so I am responsible. But I think that our decisions were correct, and we have to keep on working.
Well, Thomas Kielinger is the long-time London correspondent from the German newspaper Die Welt and joins me in the studio. Thomas, How would you read this defeat in her home state into third place? How significant is it?
Well, it is only a small state of the 60 federal states that we have, but it's significant. It's a home state, as you say, and to have been outperformed by the protest party, the Alternative for Germany, is quite a shock, quite frankly. To be pushed into third place takes some sort of living down, I'm sure. And it is a warning, and it's a shot across the bow. We have national elections in a year from now, and it adds to the uncertainty about the fate of the current government and about Angela Merkel personally.
What are people saying about what we just heard Angela Merkel saying, that this was something to do with her attitude to refugees? This defeat was directly linked to that open refugee policy.
Well, it is not rocket science to link this event to her refugee policy. What is amazing is that it's the first time she actually recognized it may have something to do with her decision last year to open the door to 1 million immigrants suddenly all overnight. But whether she will change course, I don't know. It's very difficult to say she should change course because these people have already arrived. You can't just kick them out.
And they're still arriving to some extent.
And some are still arriving, and you're really pushing the problem onto the local level of communities and councils to take care of it. And that's where the protest is brewing and growing. And I just hope that this is not going to turn Germany into a sort of xenophobic sort of populace. But it takes some absorbing such a number of refugees suddenly arriving when we are not traditionally an immigrant country like Britain is and has been. So the challenge is still there, and she would be careful not to repeat her mantra, "We can cope with it," in German, "Wir schaffen es."
She hasn't said that lately.
She said it in the run-up to the election, amazingly. A sort of a sign of defiance. She's not going to be moved off her belief, but she'd better think twice before she uses it again.
Do we know much about who is voting for the Alternative for Germany? I mean, is it former CDU supporters? Are they new voters who haven't voted before, or even from other parties, even from the left?
There are two strands in the protest that you find on that side of the democratic camp. One is immigration. That protest about it coming from all quarters, not just the right. Just the right. It is a general concern, and a genuine one for that matter. But there's also an aversion towards the euro and the euro policies by the European Central Bank in Frankfurt, which is still in a phase of easy money, making it easier for the southern countries to recuperate.
So there's Euroscepticism as well as
It's a huge amount of Euroscepticism. Actually, there are two platforms on which the AfD runs. One is Euroscepticism and the other is immigration policies.
Very, very briefly, I mean, Angela Merkel has been a survivor. She's got through troubles before. I mean,
11 years, but she's going into that ominous 12th year, and nobody has gone beyond that yet, unless they have been turned out. So it is a question mark over her fate, and it adds to the general perception of unease in Europe, which may help the British position in negotiating with the European partners.
Thomas Kühlinger, we must leave it there. Thank you very much from Die Welt.
Thank you.
Now, scientists working in the French Alps have just completed the first phase of a mission to extract ice from some of the world's most rapidly shrinking glaciers. Temperatures in some parts of the Alps have risen by 1.5 degrees in the last 10 years. So scientists are drilling deep into the ice near Europe's highest mountain, Mont Blanc, to preserve samples to study for clues about the history of the Earth's climate, as Victoria Gill explains.
Approaching a very high altitude laboratory. This team of scientists is living and working on the glacier here at Col du Dôme because climate change is heating and changing the ice that they're camped on. So the team wants to rescue the information locked deep in the ice before it disappears.
Snowfalls will collect all the impurities in the atmosphere, and these will be deposited on the glacier. So all this information is stored in the glacier, like pages in a book. So when you core through this book, you can read all this information.
This is a frozen library. Tiny air bubbles locked inside the layers of this glacial ice are a record of our past atmosphere and climate.
That's an ice core now coming up from about 30 metres depth. The team will cut it and they'll move it into this tent, and then they'll store it in their ice cave, which is their mountain freezer. Okay, oh yeah, it's slippery.
So precious are these samples that the team has dug into the solid ice to build a storeroom that will keep them cold. But they won't be here long.
You can see every 6 core per box.
6 cores a box, and then they're ready to go.
Yeah, ready to go.
This is the beginning of a very long journey for these ice cores. They'll be stored here in France for 2 years, but their ultimate destination is the world's most reliable freezer, Antarctica.
The idea of getting ice from the Alps transported to Antarctica could sound very silly to people, but it makes a lot of sense for us. Basically, our main will is to be able to store these ice cores for decades to centuries. We put the ice core there, they are in the safest position you can think about.
Many glaciers here in the Alps and all over the world are changing, melting and retreating. This ambitious archive aims to preserve particles, bubbles, even bacteria trapped in the deepest, oldest ice, allowing future scientists to track our planet's past atmosphere and climate and help predict its future. Victoria Gill, BBC News, the French Alps.
That's it from the programme. The weather's coming next, but from me, Karen Giannoni, and the rest of the team. Goodbye for now.